Previously, we journeyed through the book of Numbers, witnessing the trials, victories, and lessons of the Israelites as they wandered through the wilderness. God guided them with miracles, laws, and promises. We saw how Moses led them with patience, how they faced consequences for their disobedience, and how a new generation rose, ready to enter the promised land. Now, as we step into the book of Deuteronomy, we find Moses standing before the people, giving his final words before they cross into the land that God promised to their ancestors. These are his last instructions, reminders, and warnings, words of wisdom meant to prepare them for what lies ahead. After 40 years in the wilderness, the Israelites finally arrived in the land of Moab, near the Jordan River, just across from the land God had promised them. Moses gathered the people and spoke to them, reminding them of everything that had happened on their journey. He recalled the incident at Mount Horeb. God had told them, "You have stayed here long enough. It is time to move forward." God had commanded them to go and take the land he had promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The people had grown into a great nation, as numerous as the stars, and Moses knew he couldn't manage them alone. So, he told them to choose wise and understanding men from their tribes to serve as leaders. They agreed, and Moses appointed captains over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, as well as judges to ensure fair decisions. He commanded these judges, "Be just in your judgments. Treat everyone equally, and do not be afraid, because the judgment belongs to God." If a matter was too difficult, it would be brought to Moses. Then, Moses reminded them how they had set out from Horeb and traveled through the vast, difficult wilderness until they reached Kadesh Barnea. There, he told them, "God has given you this land. Go and take possession of it. Do not be afraid." But instead of trusting God, the people asked to send spies first. Moses agreed, and 12 men, one from each tribe, were sent. They explored the land, reached the valley of Eshcol, and brought back fruit, reporting, "It is a good land that the Lord is giving us." But instead of trusting God, the people were afraid. In their tents, they whispered, "God brought us here to destroy us." The people in that land are stronger and taller. Their cities have high walls. We even saw giants there, the Anakim. Moses tried to encourage them, saying, "Do not be afraid. The Lord will fight for you, just as he did in Egypt. He has carried you, like a father carries his child." But still, they refused to trust God. God was angered by their unbelief. He swore that none of that generation would enter the promised land, except for Caleb, who had fully trusted him. Even Moses was not allowed to enter because of what happened later. Instead, Joshua, Moses' assistant, was chosen to lead the people. Then God declared, "Your children, whom you said would be captured by enemies, will inherit this land." When God told the Israelites to turn back and head toward the wilderness, they suddenly changed their minds. Now, they wanted to fight for the land after all. They put on their weapons and prepared to go into the hill country, thinking they could take the land by their own strength. Moses warned them, "Do not go. The Lord is not with you in this. You will be defeated." But they ignored him. They marched forward anyway, believing they could win. Then, the Amorites came out like a swarm of bees, attacking them fiercely. The Israelites were struck down and chased all the way to Hormah. Defeated and broken, they wept before God, but he did not listen. They had already disobeyed him. So, they remained in Kadesh for a long time before continuing their journey. After wandering near Mount Seir for many days, God spoke again. "You have circled this mountain long enough. Turn north." As they passed through the land of the Edomites, God warned them, "Do not fight them. I have given Mount Seir to Esau as his possession. You must buy food and water from them, for I have taken care of you these 40 years, and you have lacked nothing." They obeyed and moved past Edom, traveling through the wilderness near Moab. Then, God spoke again. "Do not attack the Moabites, for I have given their land to the descendants of Lot." Moses reminded the people that the Moabites had taken this land from a strong people called the Ems, who were as tall and powerful as the Anakim, the race of giants. Likewise, the Edomites had taken Mount Seir from the Horites. Then, God commanded them to cross the brook Seir, marking the end of the wilderness journey for that generation. 38 years had passed since they left Kadesh Barnea, and all the men of war from the first generation had died, just as God had sworn. Once they were gone, God spoke again. "Now, pass through Moab and continue your journey." As they neared the land of the Ammonites, God warned them once more, "Do not fight them. I have given their land to the descendants of Lot." Moses explained that this land had also been home to giants called the Zamzummim, as tall and strong as the Anakim. But God had destroyed them before the Ammonites, just as he had done for the Edomites and Moabites. Similarly, the Caphtorites had driven out the Avim and settled in their land. Then God commanded them to cross the river Arnon and prepare for battle against Sihon, the king of Heshbon, an Amorite ruler. God told them that he had already given Sihon's land into their hands and that the surrounding nations would soon hear about them and fear them. So, Moses sent messengers to King Sihon, asking for permission to pass peacefully through his land, offering to buy food and water just as they had done with the Edomites and Moabites. But Sihon refused to let them pass. God had hardened his heart, making him stubborn so that he would be delivered into Israel's hands. Sihon gathered his army and attacked the Israelites at Jahaz, but God gave Israel victory. They defeated Sihon and his entire army, capturing all his cities and leaving no survivors, except for the livestock and spoils, which they kept for themselves. From the city of Aroer by the river Arnon to Gilead, there was not a single city too strong for them because God handed them all over. However, they did not invade the land of the Ammonites or cross the river Jabbok, because God had forbidden them from doing so. After defeating Sihon, the Israelites continued their journey toward Bashan, but King Og of Bashan came out with his army to fight them at Edrei. God told Moses not to be afraid because he had already given Og, his people, and his land into their hands, just as he had done with Sihon. So, they fought and completely destroyed Og and his army, leaving no survivors. They captured all his cities, 60 in total, including the region of Argob in Bashan. These cities were well fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, along with many small villages. Just as they had done with Sihon, they destroyed everyone in these cities but kept the livestock and valuable goods for themselves. They took the land of these two Amorite kings from the river Arnon to Mount Hermon, which was known by different names among the surrounding nations. The entire region, including the plains, Gilead, and Bashan, was taken, all the way to Salcah and Edrei, which were part of Og's kingdom. Og was the last of the Rephaim, a race of giants, and his iron bed was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, still kept in Rabbath of the Ammonites. After taking possession of the land, Moses divided it among the tribes. The land from Aroer by the Arnon River, including half of Mount Gilead and its cities, was given to the tribes of Reuben and Gad. The rest of Gilead and all of Bashan, which had been the land of giants, was given to half the tribe of Manasseh. Jair, a descendant of Manasseh, took the entire region of Argob, extending to the borders of Geshur and Makkah, and named the villages after himself, calling them Bashan Havoth Jair. Moses also gave Gilead to Machir. The Reubenites and Gadites received the land stretching from Gilead to the Arnon River, including half the valley and up to the Jabbok River, which bordered the Ammonites. They also received the plains and land along the Jordan, from Chinnereth, the Sea of Galilee, to the Salt Sea, east of Mount Pisgah. Then Moses reminded the people that God had given them this land, but they were still required to help their fellow Israelites cross over into the promised land and fight. The men of war were to go armed ahead of their brothers, while their wives, children, and livestock remained in the cities they had been given. Once their fellow Israelites had also settled in the land across the Jordan, they would be allowed to return to their own land. At that time, Moses also encouraged Joshua, reminding him of the victories God had already given them over these two kings. He assured Joshua that God would do the same for the other kingdoms they would face and that he should not be afraid because God would fight for them. Moses then recalled how he had pleaded with God, asking to cross the Jordan and see the beautiful land, including the mountains and Lebanon. But God was angry with him because of the people's disobedience and refused to grant his request. Instead, God told him to stop asking and to climb to the top of Mount Pisgah, where he could look in all directions and see the land from afar, as that was the closest he would get. Then, God commanded Moses to strengthen and encourage Joshua, because Joshua would be the one to lead the people into the land and help them take possession of it. So, the Israelites remained in the valley near Beth Peor. Moses warned the people to follow God's commands exactly as given, without adding or taking anything away. He reminded them of what had happened at Baal Peor, where those who worshipped the false god Baal were destroyed, but those who remained faithful to God were still alive. He explained that the laws and judgments God had given them were meant to be followed because they would show other nations how wise and understanding the Israelites were. He asked them to think about it. What other nation was so blessed to have God so near to them or to have such righteous laws? He urged them to be careful never to forget what they had seen and experienced and to teach these things to their children and future generations. Then, Moses reminded them of the day they stood before God at Mount Horeb, when he spoke to them from the fire. The mountain was burning with flames that reached the sky, covered in darkness and thick clouds. They heard God's voice, but saw no form. He gave them his covenant, the 10 Commandments, and wrote them on 2 stone tablets. At that time, God also commanded Moses to teach them his laws so they would obey them in the land they were about to enter. Moses warned them to be very careful not to make idols of any kind, whether in the form of a man, woman, animal, bird, creeping creature, or fish. He also cautioned them against worshipping the sun, moon, and stars, as other nations did, because God had chosen Israel as his special people and had brought them out of Egypt like metal refined in a furnace. Moses again reminded them that because of their disobedience, God was angry with him and had sworn that he would not enter the promised land. He told them that they would cross over and take possession of the land, but he would not. He urged them not to forget their covenant with God or make idols, because God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Moses warned the people that if they turned away from God and worshipped idols, they would not stay in the land for long. They would be destroyed and scattered among other nations, where they would be forced to worship lifeless gods made of wood and stone, gods that could not see, hear, eat, or smell. But he also gave them hope, saying that if they truly sought God with all their heart and soul, even in their suffering, they would find him. He reassured them that God is merciful and would not abandon them or forget the covenant he made with their ancestors. Moses urged them to think about history and ask if anything so great had ever happened before. Had any other people ever heard God's voice speaking from the fire and survived? Had any other nation been rescued from slavery by such great miracles, signs, and wonders as Israel had been in Egypt? God had done all these things to show them that he alone is God and that there is no other. He reminded them that God had spoken from heaven to teach them and had shown his power on earth through fire. Because God loved their ancestors, he chose their descendants and brought them out of Egypt with great power. He drove out nations stronger than them, so that they could inherit the land he had promised. Moses urged them to understand in their hearts that God alone rules over heaven and earth, and that they should obey his laws, so that they and their children would live long in the land he was giving them forever. After this, Moses set apart 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan as places of refuge. These cities were meant for anyone who accidentally killed someone without intent or hatred, so they could flee there and be safe. The cities were Bezer in the wilderness for the tribe of Reuben, Ramoth in Gilead for the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan for the tribe of Manasseh. Moses then reminded them that these were the laws, testimonies, and commands he had given them after they came out of Egypt. This was in the land they had taken from Sion. They had also conquered the land of Og. This land stretched from Aroer, near the Arnon River, to Mount Hermon and included all the plains on the east side of the Jordan, reaching down to the Salt Sea, near the slopes of Pisgah. God had warned that he would punish those who hated him for generations, but would show mercy to those who loved him and obeyed his commands. They were not to misuse God's name because he would not let those who dishonor his name go unpunished. They were to keep the Sabbath day holy by resting, just as God had commanded. They were allowed to work for 6 days, but on the 7th day, they were to rest, along with their children, servants, animals, and any foreigners in their land. Moses reminded them that they had once been slaves in Egypt, and God had rescued them with great power, which is why he commanded them to keep the Sabbath day. Moses then told them that they must honor their father and mother so that they could live long and have a good life in the land God was giving them. They were not to murder, commit adultery, steal, or testify falsely against their neighbor. They were also not to desire or covet their neighbor's wife, house, land, servants, animals, or anything else that belonged to someone else. Moses reminded them that these were the words God had spoken directly to them from the fire, cloud, and thick darkness on the mountain with a loud voice. God had not added anything more, but he had written these commands on 2 stone tablets and given them to Moses. Moses reminded them that when they had heard God's voice from the fire and saw the mountain burning, they had been terrified. Their leaders and elders had come to Moses, saying that they had seen God's greatness and heard his voice, yet they were afraid they would die if they heard him speak again. They believed no human could survive hearing the voice of the living God directly. So they had asked Moses to go near to God, hear his words, and then come back and tell them everything he said, promising that they would obey. God had heard their request and agreed that they had spoken wisely. He had wished that they would always have such a heart to fear him and keep his commands so that they and their children would always be blessed. Then God had told Moses to send the people back to their tents, but Moses was to stay and receive all the laws, commands, and judgments so he could teach them how to live in the land they were about to enter. Moses warned them that they were to talk about God at home, on the road, when they lay down at night, and when they got up in the morning. They were to tie these words as a sign on their hands, place them between their eyes, and write them on the doorposts of their houses and on their gates. Moses warned them that once God brought them into the land he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they would receive great and prosperous cities they had not built, houses full of good things they had not filled, wells they had not dug, and vineyards and olive trees they had not planted. When they had eaten and were satisfied, they must be careful not to forget God, who had rescued them from slavery in Egypt. He reminded them to fear God, serve him alone, and swear by his name. They were not to follow the gods of the surrounding nations, because God was a jealous God and would become angry, which could lead to their destruction. Moses told them not to test God as their ancestors had done at Massah, but to carefully obey his commandments and do what was right in his eyes. If they followed his laws, things would go well for them, and he would drive out their enemies. Moses then told them that in the future, when their children asked about the meaning of the laws and commandments, they should explain how they had once been slaves in Egypt, but God had rescued them with his mighty power. He had sent great signs and plagues upon Egypt, Pharaoh, and his people. Moses said that God had commanded them to follow these laws for their own good, so they would be preserved and continue to live under his blessing. Moses told the Israelites that when God brought them into the land he had promised, he would drive out 7 powerful nations that were greater and stronger than them. When God delivered these nations into their hands, they were to completely destroy them and not make any treaties or show them mercy. They were not to intermarry with them because doing so would lead their children away from God to worship other gods, which would make God angry and bring destruction upon them. Instead, they were to destroy the altars and idols of these nations, cut down their sacred groves, and burn their carved images. Moses reminded them that they were a holy people, chosen by God to be special among all the nations. God had not chosen them because they were numerous, but because he loved them and had sworn to keep his promise to their ancestors. That is why he had rescued them from slavery in Egypt with great power. Moses reminded them that their God is faithful, keeping his covenant and showing mercy to those who love him and obey his commandments for 1,000 generations. If they obeyed, God would keep his covenant with them, bless them, and make them prosper. He would bless them with many children, abundant harvests, and large flocks and herds in the land he had promised. They would be blessed above all other nations, and there would be no barrenness among them or their livestock. God would also remove all sickness from them and protect them from the diseases they had seen in Egypt, instead bringing those plagues upon their enemies. Moses knew the Israelites might feel afraid, thinking that these nations were too strong to defeat. But he reminded them not to fear, because they had seen what God did to Pharaoh and all of Egypt, the miracles, signs, and wonders by which he rescued them with his mighty power. In the same way, God would deal with the nations they feared. He would even send hornets to drive them out until none of them were left. However, God would not remove these nations all at once, because if he did, wild animals would multiply and become a problem for them. Instead, he would drive them out little by little until the Israelites had fully taken over the land. God would hand over the kings of these nations and completely destroy them so that no one could stand against them. Moses warned them to burn the idols of these nations and not to be tempted by the gold and silver on them, because it was detestable to God. They were not to bring anything from these idols into their homes, or they would become cursed like those objects. Moses told them to remember how God had led them through the wilderness for 40 years to humble them and test their hearts to see if they would obey his commands. During this time, God allowed them to experience hunger but provided manna, something neither they nor their ancestors had known before. This was to teach them that life is not sustained by bread alone, but by every word that comes from God. He reminded them that during those 40 years, their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. Just as a father disciplines his child, God had disciplined them for their own good. Because of this, they were to obey his commands, walk in his ways, and show reverence for him. Moses told them that God was bringing them into a rich and fertile land with streams, springs, and deep waters flowing from valleys and hills. It was a land filled with wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. There, they would have plenty to eat, never experience scarcity, and even find valuable minerals like iron and copper in the hills. When they ate and were satisfied, they were to remember to give thanks to God for the good land he had given them. He cautioned that when they had eaten well, built fine houses, and seen their flocks, silver, and gold increase, they should not let pride enter their hearts and forget that it was God who rescued them from slavery in Egypt. He reminded them of how God had led them safely through the dangerous wilderness, filled with fiery serpents, scorpions, and dry, waterless land. God had miraculously provided water from a rock and fed them with manna to humble and test them so that in the end, they would receive his blessings. Moses told the Israelites that they were about to cross the Jordan River and take possession of lands belonging to nations that were stronger and more powerful than them. These nations had great cities with high walls, and were inhabited by the Anakim, a tall and mighty people that others feared. However, Moses assured them that God himself would go before them like a consuming fire, destroying these nations and handing them over to the Israelites, so they could drive them out quickly. He warned them not to think that they were receiving this land because they were righteous, but rather because of the wickedness of these nations. God was driving them out to fulfill the promise he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not because the Israelites were better than others. In fact, Moses reminded them that they were a stubborn people who had often rebelled against God. He told them not to forget how they had made God angry in the wilderness, from the day they left Egypt until that very moment. At Mount Horeb, they had provoked God so much that he had wanted to destroy them. Moses recalled how he had gone up the mountain for 40 days and nights, without food or water to receive the 2 stone tablets, which contained the covenant written by God's own hand. But after those 40 days, God told him to go back down quickly, because the Israelites had already corrupted themselves by making a golden idol. God said they had turned away from his commandments so quickly, that he was ready to destroy them and make a new, greater nation from Moses instead. Moses then recounted how he had come down the mountain with the stone tablets, while the mountain was still burning with fire. When he saw that the people had made a golden calf and were worshipping it, he was so angry that he threw down the tablets, breaking them in front of everyone. He then fell before God again for another 40 days and nights, fasting and pleading for the people because of their terrible sin. He feared that God's anger would destroy them completely, but God listened to his prayers. Moses also prayed for Aaron, because God was very angry with him for allowing the people to make the idol. Then Moses took the golden calf, burned it, crushed it into fine dust, and threw it into the stream flowing from the mountain. He reminded them that they had continued to provoke God in different places, at Taberah, Massah, Kibroth-Hattaavah, and even at Kadesh Barnea, when they refused to enter the land God had promised them. Despite all the miracles they had seen, they still doubted God and did not obey his voice. Moses had prayed, asking God not to wipe out the nation he had saved with his great power. He reminded God of his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and asked him not to focus on the stubbornness, wickedness, and sin of the people. Moses also pleaded that if God destroyed Israel, other nations might say that he had failed to bring them into the promised land or that he had led them out of Egypt only to kill them in the wilderness. He ended by reminding God that these people were still his chosen ones, whom he had rescued with his mighty hand and outstretched arm. Moses reminded the Israelites that after he had broken the first stone tablets, God told him to carve 2 new ones like the first and bring them up the mountain. He was also instructed to make an ark of wood to store them. So Moses made an ark from acacia wood, cut 2 stone tablets, and went up the mountain carrying them. God then wrote the 10 commandments on these new tablets, just as he had written on the first ones, and gave them to Moses. When Moses came down, he placed the tablets inside the ark as God had commanded, and they remained there. Then, the Israelites continued their journey from Beeroth to Moserah, where Aaron died and was buried. His son Eleazar took over as the high priest. From there, they traveled to Gudgodah and then to Jotbath, a land with rivers of water. During this time, God set apart the tribe of Levi to carry the Ark of the Covenant, to serve him, and to pronounce blessings in his name. Unlike the other tribes, the Levites did not receive land as an inheritance because their inheritance was serving God himself, just as he had promised them. Moses also reminded them that he had stayed on the mountain for another 40 days and nights, just as he had the first time, pleading with God not to destroy them. He told them that all God wanted was for them to fear him, walk in his ways, love him, and serve him with all their heart and soul. They were to obey his commandments, not as a burden, but for their own good. God defends the fatherless and the widows and cares for the foreigners by providing them with food and clothing. Because of this, the Israelites were also to love and care for strangers, remembering that they were once strangers in Egypt. He urged them to fear and serve God, to stay close to him, and to honor his name. He reminded them that God had done mighty and incredible things for them, things they had seen with their own eyes. Their ancestors had gone to Egypt as a small group of 70 people, but now God had multiplied them into a vast nation as numerous as the stars in the sky. Moses told the Israelites to love God and always obey his commands, laws, and instructions. He reminded them that he was speaking directly to them, not to their children who had not witnessed God's great power and miracles. Moses explained that the land they were about to enter was very different from Egypt. In Egypt, they had to water their fields by hand like a vegetable garden, but in Canaan, the land was filled with hills and valleys that received rain directly from heaven. It was a land that God himself cared for, watching over it throughout the entire year. Moses assured them that if they loved God and served him with all their heart and soul, he would bless the land with rain at the right times, allowing them to harvest plenty of grain, wine, and oil. Their livestock would also have enough grass, and they would always have enough to eat. However, he warned them not to be deceived and turn away to worship other gods, because that would anger God. If they did, he would stop the rain, the land would stop producing food, and they would quickly perish from the good land he had given them. Moses urged them to keep these words in their hearts and souls. He told them to tie them as a reminder on their hands and foreheads, to teach them to their children, and to talk about them at home, while traveling, before bed, and in the morning. They were to write them on the doorposts of their houses and on their gates, so they and their descendants would live long in the land God had promised them, as long as the sky remained over the earth. If they followed God, they would take possession of lands belonging to nations more powerful than them. Every place they stepped on would belong to them, stretching from the wilderness to Lebanon, from the Euphrates River to the Western Sea. No one would be able to stand against them because God would make all the people of the land afraid of them, just as he had promised. Moses then set before them a choice, a blessing or a curse. If they obeyed God's commands, they would be blessed. If they disobeyed and followed other gods, they would be cursed. When they entered the land, they were to proclaim the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. These mountains were across the Jordan, in the land of the Canaanites, near Gilgal, by the plains of Moor. Once they crossed the Jordan and settled in the land God was giving them, he would give them rest from their enemies, and they would live in safety. Then, at the place God would choose for his name, they were to bring their offerings and rejoice with their families, servants, and the Levites, who had no land of their own. Moses instructed them not to offer burnt sacrifices just anywhere, but only at the place God would choose. However, they could eat meat within their own towns whenever they wanted, as long as they followed God's blessing. Clean and unclean people alike could eat it, just as they ate wild game, but they were never to eat the blood. The blood was to be poured out on the ground like water. They were not to eat the tithes of their grain, wine, oil, or the firstborn of their herds and flocks in their own towns. These had to be brought to the place God would choose, where they would eat them before him and rejoice. Moses also reminded them to always take care of the Levites, since they did not have their own inheritance. If the land God gave them was large and the place of worship was too far away, they could eat from their flocks and herds in their own towns as they desired. Any holy offerings and vows were to be taken to the place God would choose, and burnt offerings were to be presented on his altar, with the blood poured out as required. Moses urged them to carefully obey all these instructions so that they and their children would prosper, doing what was good and right in God's eyes. Moses warned them that once God removed the nations before them and they settled in the land, they must not fall into the trap of following the religious practices of those nations. They were not to ask how these people worshiped their gods and attempt to do the same for the Lord. The worship of these nations was filled with detestable practices that God hated, including sacrificing their own sons and daughters in fire to their gods. Moses warned the Israelites that if a prophet or someone who claimed to have dreams performed signs or wonders and then told them to follow other gods, they were not to listen to that person. Even if the sign or miracle came true, it was a test from God to see if they truly loved Him with all their heart and soul. They were to remain faithful, fear God, obey His commands, and serve Him alone. Any prophet or dreamer who tried to turn them away from God was to be put to death because they were leading the people away from the one who had rescued them from slavery in Egypt. This was necessary to remove such evil from among them. Moses also warned them that if a close family member, a brother, son, daughter, wife, or even a beloved friend, tried to secretly persuade them to worship other gods, whether from nearby or far away, they were not to listen or show any pity. They were not to protect or hide such a person but instead were to ensure that they were punished. The person who was first approached was to be the first to take action, followed by the rest of the people, and the guilty one was to be stoned to death for trying to turn them away from God. This severe punishment would serve as a warning to all of Israel so that no one else would commit such wickedness. Moses then told them that if they heard rumors that an entire city among them had turned away to worship other gods, they were to investigate carefully. They were to search and ask questions to make sure the accusation was true. If it was confirmed that the people of the city had committed this great sin, they were to destroy the city completely, killing all its inhabitants and livestock. They were to gather all the possessions of the city into the streets and burn everything, leaving nothing behind. The city was to remain in ruins forever and was never to be rebuilt. No one was allowed to take anything from the destruction, so that God's anger would turn away, and He would show them mercy, bless them, and allow them to prosper, just as He had promised their ancestors. This would happen if they remained faithful, obeyed His commandments, and did what was right in His eyes. Moses reminded the Israelites that they were God's children and a holy people chosen to be special among all the nations. Because of this, they were not to follow certain mourning practices, such as cutting themselves or shaving their heads in specific ways for the dead. They were also not to eat anything that was considered unclean. He then listed the animals they were allowed to eat, including oxen, sheep, goats, deer, wild goats, and other similar animals. They could eat any land animal that had split hooves and chewed the cud, but animals that only did one of these, such as camels, hares, and pigs, were unclean and not to be eaten or touched if they were dead. For sea creatures, they could eat anything with fins and scales, but anything without them, such as shellfish, was unclean. Moses also listed birds they could not eat, including eagles, vultures, kites, ravens, owls, hawks, storks, bats, and other similar birds. All flying insects that crawled were unclean, but clean birds were allowed to be eaten. They were also not to eat anything that had died on its own, but they could give it to a foreigner living among them or sell it to a non-Israelite. Moses also repeated the command that they should not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. He then instructed them to set aside 1/10 of their harvest each year as a tithe to God. They were to take this tithe, whether grain, wine, oil, or the firstborn of their animals, to the place God would choose for His name, where they would eat it in His presence and learn to always honor Him. If the journey to that place was too far, they were allowed to sell the tithe for money, take the money to the chosen place, and use it to buy whatever they desired, such as oxen, sheep, wine, or other goods. They would then eat and rejoice before God with their household. Every 3 years, they were to bring their tithe and store it in their towns so that the Levites, along with foreigners, orphans, and widows, could have enough to eat. If they followed these commands, God would bless all the work of their hands and make them prosper. Moses told the Israelites that at the end of every 7 years, they were to cancel all debts owed by their fellow Israelites. This was known as the Lord's release. Any Israelite who had loaned money to another was to forgive the debt and not demand repayment, though they could still collect from foreigners. This law ensured that there would be no poverty among them, as God would bless them greatly in the land He had given them. However, this blessing would come only if they carefully obeyed God's commandments. If they followed His laws, they would become lenders to many nations but would not need to borrow, and they would rule over others rather than be ruled themselves. Moses also commanded them to be generous toward the poor. If there was someone in need among them, they were not to be hard-hearted or selfish but were to freely lend whatever was needed. They were warned not to withhold help just because the 7th year was near, thinking they would lose their money. If they refused to help, the poor person might cry out to God, and they would be guilty of sin. Instead, they were to give willingly without resentment, and God would bless all the work of their hands. He also gave instructions regarding Hebrew servants. If an Israelite man or woman was sold into servitude, they were to serve for 6 years and then be set free in the 7th year. When releasing them, they were not to be sent away empty-handed but were to be given a generous share of their master's flock, grain, and wine. This was because they were to remember that they had once been slaves in Egypt, and God had redeemed them. However, if the servant loved their master and wanted to stay, they could choose to remain permanently. This was done by piercing their ear with an awl as a sign of lifelong service. The same rule applied to female servants. Moses reminded them not to feel burdened by releasing their servants, as they had worked for 6 years and had provided double the value of a hired worker. If they obeyed this law, God would bless them in all they did. Moses also instructed them to set apart the firstborn males of their herds and flocks as holy to God. These animals were not to be used for labor or sheared but were to be brought to the place God chose, where they and their families would eat them in His presence each year. However, if an animal had any defects, such as being lame, blind, or having any other imperfection, it was not to be sacrificed. Instead, it could be eaten in their towns by both clean and unclean people, just like wild game. The only restriction was that they were not to eat the blood. Instead, they were to pour it out on the ground like water. Moses commanded the Israelites to observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to honor God because it was in this month that He brought them out of Egypt at night. They were to sacrifice the Passover offering from their flocks and herds at the place God would choose for His name to dwell. They were not to eat leavened bread with it, but for 7 days they were to eat unleavened bread, also called the bread of affliction, to remember how they left Egypt in haste. For those 7 days, no leavened bread was to be found anywhere in their land, and none of the meat from the sacrifice was to be left until the next morning. The Passover sacrifice could not be offered just anywhere but only at the place God chose. It was to be done at sunset, just as they had left Egypt. They were to roast and eat the sacrifice there and then return to their tents the next morning. For 6 days, they were to eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day, there was to be a solemn assembly to God where no work was to be done. Moses also told them to count 7 weeks from the beginning of the grain harvest and then celebrate the Feast of Weeks. They were to bring a freewill offering to God based on how He had blessed them. This was to be a time of rejoicing before God, where they, along with their children, servants, the Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows, would celebrate in the place He chose. After gathering their harvest, they were to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days. It was to be a joyful time, and everyone, including their families, servants, Levites, and those in need, was to participate. This festival was to be held at the place God chose because he would bless their harvest and all the work of their hands, so they were to rejoice. 3 times a year, all the men of Israel were to appear before God at the place he chose, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. They were not to come before God empty-handed but were to bring gifts according to how God had blessed them. Moses also instructed them to appoint judges and officers in all their towns to ensure fair judgment. They were not to pervert justice by showing favoritism or accepting bribes, because bribes blind even the wise and corrupt fair decisions. They were to always pursue what was just, so that they could live and inherit the land God was giving them. Lastly, they were warned not to plant sacred groves of trees near God's altar or set up any carved images, as these were detestable to him. If anyone in their towns was found guilty of committing evil by breaking God's covenant and worshipping other gods, including the sun, moon, or stars, which God had not commanded, the matter had to be thoroughly investigated. If it was proven to be true, the guilty person, whether man or woman, was to be taken outside the city gates and stoned to death. However, no one could be put to death based on the testimony of just one witness. There had to be at least 2 or 3 witnesses. The witnesses themselves were to throw the first stones, followed by the rest of the people, to remove evil from among them. Moses also gave instructions for handling difficult legal cases involving disputes over bloodshed, legal rights, or bodily harm. If such matters were too difficult for local judges to decide, the people were to go to the place God would choose and seek guidance from the priests and the judge at that time. They were to follow the ruling given to them without deviation. If anyone arrogantly refused to obey the priest or judge, they were to be put to death to remove rebellion from Israel. This would serve as a warning so that others would hear and fear, ensuring that people would no longer act with pride and disobedience. Moses then addressed the future time when the Israelites would enter the land and desire to appoint a king like other nations. If they chose to do so, they were to appoint a king that God himself would choose, someone from among their own people, not a foreigner. The king was not to acquire too many horses for himself or lead the people back to Egypt to get more horses, since God had already commanded them never to return there. He was also not to take many wives, as they could turn his heart away from God, nor was he to accumulate excessive silver and gold. When the king took the throne, he was to write a copy of God's law from the scroll kept by the priests. He was to keep this law with him and read it daily so that he would learn to fear God, obey his commands, and remain faithful. This would prevent him from becoming proud and thinking himself above his people, and it would keep him from straying from God's instructions. If he followed these commands, he and his descendants would have a long and prosperous reign in Israel. Moses' words were not just history, they were a call to faith, obedience, and trust in God. He knew he would not enter the land, but he wanted the people to be ready. The journey was almost over. Would they remain faithful? If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe and stay with us as we continue through the Bible. The journey is far from over. Let's discover together what happens next.